My lords, I bring news about galactic developments. As some of you may be aware, the Stellaris development team have been seeking views on the game via the VISON, which is essentially a forum post. But I am aware that Eladrin, the game director, is also following discussion on both Reddit, and he frequents the official Discord regularly. According to the developers, they are leaving discussions open until the end of November, so if you have burning questions and/or thoughts about what's going to happen in 2025, then I suggest you visit these places and make yourself heard. I'll make sure to leave links in the description. Now, in this week's developer diary, Eladrin discusses the future of Stellaris in 2025 and beyond. A number of topics and themes are discussed, and that's what we're going to cover today. I should stress, with a big red disclaimer text that is hopefully flashing on screen, that according to the dev diary, this is not intended to read as a timeline or list of promises, but an open discussion about things I consider possibilities and why. So with the disclaimer out of the way, let's get into it. And the developers are starting with biological and psionic ascension. According to the developer team, they strongly believe that remastering the remaining ascension paths is a top priority. The Machine Age dramatically improved cybernetic and synthetic ascension, and gave machine empires proper ascension choices, but they left others behind. Biological ascension is not in a good state right now mechanically or as an overall experience. Psionic ascension is better off, as it's effective tangentially by most content releases, but is a bit too reliant on random events and luck. Both of these ascension paths will be revamped, though since they are very distinct from one another, I intend on having them focused on in 2 separate releases. So, is this as obvious sign as possible that we are getting biological and psionic ascension, and that they're going to get the Machine Age style DLCs? I made a video on what's next for Stellaris prior to the release of the Grand Archive, and a large portion of the comments in that video were asking for exactly this, maybe with a twist of the hive mind thrown in as well. I think that the statement, I intend on having them focused on in 2 separate releases, is as clear as we're going to get that is probably what's coming. Of course, the question is when. Given how well Machine Age was received by the community, I think the task to replicate the success with a similar bio and psionic expansion is going to be tough. I wonder if they would go about it in a similar way. Would they replicate the 3 ascension paths? If so, what would those 3 ascension paths be? I do think it would be a mistake not to include or give hive minds some sort of love in any organic focused expansion. Otherwise, hives would be extremely left out with their limited ascension options. And I also think that a huge part of the success of Machine Age has to be placed at the feet of the Cosmogenesis Crisis path and, in part, Satana, although perhaps slightly less so. And I wonder, what could they do with an organic DLC that would offer a similar level of hype? I'd definitely welcome your thoughts on that, and I'm sure the developers would as well. With psionic expansion, on the other hand, the Shroud is literally the limit. I'm picturing dimensional horror invasions and demonic incursions all over the place. And maybe if we get strong enough, we could even have our civilizations ascend into energy beings. Stargate vibes, anyone? Or maybe we'll get to finish the fight between the toxic god and the end of the cycle. As someone who obviously focuses on lore, I can dream. The next topic the developers discuss is focused on warfare and war resolution. The developers have the following to say. At some point in the future, I'd like to see us revisit war and war resolution and enable more of the scenarios that can occur in the Stellaris cinematic universe. When the Gamma aliens attacked the UNE colony on Europa 7, the Commonwealth of Man did not wait patiently for an invitation for war before summoning the apocalypse. Humanity was threatened, and so they acted. More fluid rules around joining and leaving wars are needed, and betrayal is not supported to my satisfaction. Secret fealty exists, but I don't find it enough in its current state, and feel that other mechanics currently prevent them from seizing the chance for freedom at what would be their most opportune moments. I cannot overstate how much I agree with this. One of the most frustrating mechanics in the game is being locked in a war that nobody wants to be in. Why, if my overlord is fighting a losing war, can I not betray him? Why can I not enter a war to help or hinder another empire? The war system becoming more fluid would be, in my opinion, a huge boon for the game. It would make it simpler for new players to get into it, and it would allow for far more counterplay and interaction for experienced players. The multiplayer implications alone would be fantastic. The backstabbing moments, or saviour moments, that a fluid war system could create would allow for these moments that would be talked about and remembered for all of time. I cannot overstate how much I hope this happens. The only caveat is that unlike Psionic and Ascensions, the developers do not outwardly state that this is going to happen, so I guess that we will have to wait and see, but I really hope it does. Next on the list we have biological ships. Again, according to the developers, while rearing and mutating space fauna was added to Stellaris in the Grand Archive story pack, I feel it's not the same fantasy as true bio-ships. These are vessels that your people grow and fly around in, or have more symbiotic relationships with their pilots. I think these systems would pair nicely with biological ascension. I couldn't agree more with Eladrin on this. I think space fauna filled a niche for sure, but they are not the organic Leviathan Farscape style ships that they could be. Shipsets are a simple but overlooked part of the game, and an organic shipset with the attached technology and civics would, in my opinion, be wonderful for the game. The developers do say that this would be paired nicely alongside a biological ascension, which makes perfect sense, so maybe they're going to be packaged together, and maybe, just maybe, we might get to roleplay as a Tyranid hive swarm after all. I will say this, please give me one that can eat planets, give me a biological colossus, and let me eat a world. I think this would be extremely awesome. Next up we have factions and politics. According to the developers, governments in Stellaris may hold a grudge against you for centuries for your atrocities, but pops and factions are quick to forgive and forget. There are no factions that make trouble when their borders change, nor variety within the factions themselves. I'd like to see factions have their own tenets and goals and different ways that you can deal with them. There have been a lot of calls for internal politics, but I think that it would really be politics and culture in general, affecting both your empires and those around you. If we were to do something along those lines, I'd also want to add some variant of factions to Gestalt empires, maybe instincts for hives that grow more dominant based on your behaviour, or directives that compete with priority in the machine intelligence. However, they'd have to feel different from the individualist factions. Among the individualist factions, I can see tenets of an egalitarian faction from Shared Burdens being very different to the egalitarian faction in a non-worker co-op, Megacorp. And these tenets might also be used to define the beliefs of your spiritualistic factions, and I'd certainly want to explore spreading my factions into other empires. So my thoughts on this. Internal politics, or as Eladrin puts it, politics and culture, is indeed on the agenda, and I know that this one is popular with the community. It is, however, something that I am not super excited about, but despite that, I'm happy to be convinced otherwise. The two reasons that this doesn't fill me with excitement is because A, as Eladrin touches on, how would it work for hives and machines? I think that would be quite interesting to say the least. And B, because I can only imagine that it would be incredibly tedious to deal with an internal faction that doesn't want to do what you as the player wants to do. And because the system would need teeth, it would then stop you from doing said action. I'm not looking for an extra system that forces me to jump through arbitrary hoops to please a non-existent faction of people. I think I would find a system like this quite frustrating to use, and if a system like this was implemented, then I could see myself pivoting to an authoritarian type government entirely, purely so I didn't have to deal with it. In my mind, I imagine playing as an egalitarian, and your every decision is being made by committee. No thank you, that does not appeal to me. Despite the example that I just gave, that might not necessarily be what they're thinking, and I'm very happy to be convinced otherwise. Time will tell. Next up we have Espionage. According to Eladrin, Espionage is a related system to factions and politics that isn't satisfying its promise currently. As Mr. Cosmogon reminds me during every design meeting, it's difficult to keep track of spy networks. It's generally of low impact and has no real counterplay, but he has schemes. For context, Mr. Cosmogon is a content designer, and having met him in person, he's an all-round awesome guy. He is the designer who's responsible for the Knights of the Toxic God origin and storyline, and as you may have guessed from his name, the Cosmogenesis Crisis path that they added in Machine Age. I completely agree with the devs' thoughts here. Espionage is extremely underwhelming, but has so much potential, but I would be confident that in Mr. Cosmogon's hands, him and the team will come up with something fantastic. Next up we have Playable Nomads, and according to the developers, finding different ways of playing the game is popular. Landless adventuring on Crusader Kings, for example, makes me wonder what we could do with nomadic fleets in Stellaris. The key questions there end up being, why are they nomadic, and how do they interact with more standard empires? Origins could also be opportunities to table flip the normal economic or political models of Stellaris. I don't have a huge amount to add here. I think Nomads could be a cool addition to the game. I believe that their playstyle has been championed by EP30 for some time, and I think he even did a video or two on them. If Nomads are added, great. If not, I'm not going to lose any sleep over it. I do, however, think if they were added, there could be a fantastic narrative behind them. I'm thinking the Quarian from Mass Effect, for example. Next up we have pirates and space crime. According to the developers, space piracy is a popular fantasy. We touched on it a bit with the Treasure Hunter's origin in Grand Archive, but they could mesh well with the Nomads idea mentioned earlier, or even a factional political expansion. Crime and deviancy aren't a terribly engaging system at the moment either, and may benefit from a wider examination. Space piracy is, in my opinion, an interesting topic, and honestly I'm surprised it came up at all as a separate theme from the feedback, but I can see how it relates somewhat to the Nomad origin. I agree that crime and deviancy are not terribly engaging, and on this, crime megacorps come to mind. My understanding is that they are one of the most picked due to theme, but one of the most horrible empires to play as. They just aren't good at anything, and every other empire hates them. It's not an ideal situation. I do think that crime should probably be reworked alongside espionage. It's similar in theme, and both should probably interact with one another. Next up we have the developers' opinions on species packs. When it comes to species, I could see us examining what kinds of life could arise on a molten or frozen world, much like we did with toxoids. Like toxoids, they'd likely need some sort of restriction on what they can do with these worlds, as they're 10 times more abundant than normal habitable worlds, but they'd be interesting to explore. Players often ask for gaseous or energy creatures, and the first are already represented to an extent by the Dathnak, and the latter by the Unbidden. I feel that energy beings may go too far into fantasy elementals, so I'd like to stay away from them if possible. Expanding the existing species phenotypes could also potentially be interesting. A Plantoids Mark II, for example. I personally enjoy a good species pack, and I guarantee that a Plantoids 2 would be very popular with certain players. Often, there are fantastic narrative elements added with the species packs, and on occasion, even the songs. The last species pack we had was Toxoids, which was a while back now, 2022 I believe, and it's interesting that the devs were specifically highlighting the Dathnak. I'm not sure I could deal with an entire species of annoying farts. The energy beings or the elementals, however, is an interesting take, given that we have Unbidden in the game already. I don't really have strong feelings about this. We do have zombies and space magic, so I'm not quite sure where the line is being drawn between fantasy and fiction. In any case, I'm very much down for a new species pack, and I think if they repeat the season pass for 2025, I'd hope that the smaller of the 3 DLCs is a species pack, and I would hope that would include a ship set as well. But we'll see. And the final thing the devs touch on is something that they call scenarios. They have the following to say. Scenarios are another proposal that I've seen a number of times over the years. Would it be interesting to have scripted game modes with custom rules and events already in motion? They could lean hard into already established universes with asymmetric starts. A system like this would allow for challenges or narratives that could be completed in a relatively short play session compared to the standard Stellaris campaign, or could otherwise completely change the pace or nature of the game. It could also be used to craft competitive experiences. At past PDX cons, we've featured mods like Survival, Necroid Invasion, or Arc of Ascension. I could see things like that fitting into the system. Alternate game modes, however, tend to be fairly binary. They're either not used very much, or they're incredibly popular. There's not much in between. I think that this is a really interesting area to explore. Story-style campaign system or skirmish system where you have a preset, pre-built empire and several singular tasks to complete would completely change how Stellaris could be played. I'm thinking the historical battles that you can partake in games like Total War, and they have a similar setting in their Warhammer version to acquire special artifacts. And again, selfishly as a lore guy, this would have the potential to blow up the lore element of the game, as you could tell specific stories and they could be written around why the battle is happening. Examples could be the First Contact wars with the Blorg, or to go back to the trailers we discussed earlier, touch on the Commonwealth of Man saving the United Nations of Earth. The possibilities here are endless, and I'm sure that the developers could cook up some amazing content. It would also provide the modding community a fantastic opportunity to show their skills as well. Regular viewers will be well aware of Freak's Necroid mod that I've featured frequently on streams. I cannot overstate how much I enjoy that mod. I grew up on Age of Empires, Castle Wars and Soldier Store. These game modes can make or break games in my opinion. But I've talked enough, and this is important because the developers are still seeking your feedback, so go and give it to them. Just remember to be constructive and concise as possible, as someone actually has to read what you're writing. The other thing that I'll mention, and I've not been asked to do this by anyone, is to note that the Steam Awards are currently live, and there is a category called Labour of Love. It's described as, this game has been out for a while. The team is well past the debut of their creative baby, but being the good parents that they are, these devs continue to nurture and support their creation. This game, to this day, is still getting new content after all these years. Could there be a more apt description of an award for Stellaris? I don't know, but I would urge everyone still watching and listening to go and vote for Stellaris. I have, and it definitely deserves the honour. I'd also make the point that the more people playing the game means more development and support for the game in the future. Anyway, I've talked enough. I hope you enjoyed my take on what the devs have for us in the future, and if you want to hear me talk about lore, then click the video on screen now.